Mr. Abubakr.
My goal is to provide you with evidence that you need to act. You have statistics and you have social aggregated data, and you have political knowledge. What I want to give you is my story. My name is Mohamed Abubakr, civil and human rights activist from Khartoum, Sudan, born and raised. Inspired by the International Declaration of Human Rights, I've done the best I could to be there for those deprived of these rights the most. At an early age too, as Sudan has that tendency to force children to grow up way before they should. I grew up and spent most of my adult life in a comprehensively sanctioned Sudan. It wasn't an easy experience by any means. As a citizen, I struggled, and as a student, I suffered. The unintended consequences of sanctions that plagued the program put a heavy load on the average citizen of Sudan, and an even heavier load on the back of civil society in Sudan, and specifically on those of us in the humanitarian and human rights sectors. Despite the exceptions made for organizations working in this space. While I personally have been outspoken about these unintended consequences and joined the calls for reformation and modernization of US sanction policy, I did not for a second doubt the importance of having them in place. It wasn't hard to notice the strong correlation between the regime's financial comfort and violence. So against many of our personal interests, citizens and civil society, we supported the sanctions. We believed they were about bringing positive change and transformation of the human rights scene in Sudan. And holding on to the hope for the light at the end of the tunnel, we fully complied and fully backed the sanctions. So you can imagine the deep sense of sadness and betrayal widely shared by many upon hearing about the US intentions to ease sanctions and on these conditions. Conditions that completely ignored the human rights and for the citizen of Sudan who suffered in silence for so long. In my written statement, I argued against the rationale for easing sanctions against Sudan and whether sanction relief was warranted to begin with. And I argued against each of the conditions set forth by the US government for easing of sanctions. I argued against the legitimacy of Sudan as a partner in the war against the Lord's Resistance Army and its methods, while the government of Sudan and affiliated militia are still engaged in recruitment of children in the exact same fashion. And I argued against Sudan being a part of the solution to South Sudan crisis, as that situation in that violent kleptocracy needs a serious international long commitment in building South Sudan's non-existing institutions. But none of that is as important as what I'm about to say. After the European Union recently dropped the ball on its commitment for human rights by striking an ethically and morally questionable deal to stop the African refugees and economic migrants hailing from Africa to reach Europe, and hired the very same Janjaweed militia that killed hundreds of thousands of people in Darfur, now rebranded as the Rapid Response Force, there is absolutely no other champion left in the corner of those of us in Sudan fighting for human rights and dignity for the human of Sudan. The flame of hope is fading away, and the way I see it, it's up to the United States and up to this committee to keep that flame alive. I see my time is running up, and allow me to close my remarks with this. In the process of thinking what to do with Sudan and thinking of what conditions could have been better for sanctions relief, please put yourselves in the uncomfortable shoes of an activist for human rights or a journalist who dared to speak truth to power, one of the thousands and thousands unlawfully arrested, tortured, and worse. Think of what would make things better for them and others like them. Think of me and the thoughts coming through my head right now. And the scenarios, and the very plausible scenarios playing in my head as we speak, about the consequences of me coming here today, for me and for people I care about and love back home. It certainly would have been nice if the conditions for sanctions relief included language that would make me feel a little less worried and a little more at ease. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And then from Mr. Abubakar?
Abubakar.
You know, you were describing what life is like with sanctions, and maybe you could pose some alternatives. If sanctions, you know, if we continue along the direction we are, how do we get the regime to move?
I absolutely encourage re-engagement with Sudan. It's not something that I'm opposed to, essentially. I really don't think the comprehensive sanctions is the way to go, and that complete boycott is the way to induce any change. I do believe, though, in the model, the modernized sanctions model put forward by the Enough Project could be a very effective way to go and re-engage with Sudan. I also believe when and if sanction relief is warranted, it should be completely human rights based, as that's, I think, in my opinion, the way to get to any other interest of the United States in the long term.
Mm-hmm.
Re-engaging right now on these sanctions, I'm afraid, will just leave the human of Sudan behind for the very long run, and I am afraid nothing will ever change should these sanctions be removed on these conditions.
Thank you.
Let me ask you, who's in charge? You know, Bashir, is he in charge?
I want to build on one point that was made about the question of who's in charge. Definitely agree it's al-Bashir who's in charge, and I think where this is coming from, what is calling the shot at the end of the day, I believe it's not ideology or foreign power. I think it's money at the end of the day, and I think the only way to get that kind of change in human rights and religious freedom, as Lyman said, if there are elements in there that will always push aside human rights as something that is part of something on the table. And I think the way to go about it is to make human rights profitable, to make it the thing on the table, the main thing, and religious freedom and human rights the thing to negotiate about, not something additional on the table that they can cast aside.
I deeply appreciate it. We appreciate it, the subcommittee. Your information, we will get it over to the state, but more importantly, to some of the people at the White House, hopefully, because obviously we benefit from your expertise and wisdom, Congress and the executive branch. So thank you so very, very much. The hearing's adjourned.